This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Catherine and I are doing one of our Writers Book Club episodes. And we are discussing a short story by Gina Barrioult called The Woman in the Rose-Colored Dress, and you can find it online for free at narrativemagazine.com. So we will put a link in the show notes. Also, it's only 2.5 pages, so it's a very quick read. And then on our next book club episode, we'll be talking about The Lady with the Little Dog by Anton Chekhov. We'll put a link to that in this week's show notes as well. That story is longer, so if you enjoy the Writers Book Club, I recommend reading it when you've got a nice evening and a glass of wine in hand.
And that one's also at narrativemagazine.com, correct?
Correct. Yes, also at narrativemagazine.com, and both will have links in this week's show notes.
Yeah.
So, The Woman in the Rose-Colored Dress.
Yes.
First impressions or general impressions?
Yeah.
What did you think?
I wasn't expecting it to be about an affair. That was
spoiler
unexpected
alert.
to me. Well, 2.5 pages. If you didn't get there's the middle of page 2. But I didn't expect that. I was really enjoying the contrast of the 13-year-old girl wanting to be nowhere near her mother, and then her dad shows up and she's holding his hand. I just thought that was so, like, she's growing up, but she's not, but she's still that child, right? It's kind of that line that they're playing with in this story. So it was all of that kind of, I was expecting something around that, not so much about her dad. So.
Right, which gets at so many interesting things. It's such a short story, and there's so much to unpack, and what you just said illustrates that by giving us so much already to discuss. You know, the story is a coming of age story.
It is.
And when I read it, I thought, oh, wow. She, like, another writer could have written the same exact story, and it could have been 50 pages.
Oh, yeah.
And she did it in 2.5. I don't even, I mean, this is flash fiction. I don't even know if we hit 1,000 words. I didn't bother to count a page. Can you tell? You know.
Oh, no. Yeah, it's probably closer to 750 than 1,000. I would guess.
Yeah, I would think so. And within that very condensed space, we've got 4 characters of note, which is a lot for Flash. You know, usually you kind of stick to one end of support, but we've got the girl who's narrating. She tells us right away it's almost her 13th birthday. They're a day or two shy of her 13th birthday, and her mother lets her go to a grown-up party. Right? So we get that transitional moment between childhood and womanhood, where so let's look here. 1, 2, 3. The third sentence reads, "Whenever I glanced up, I met a glance, and nobody spoke jokingly to me the way they do to a child. And when men came up to me, they treated me with a kind of knowingness, as if I were already steeped in the experiences I had only imagined." That one sentence encapsulates everything this story is about. Even though we don't know what's going to happen, we get that it's this moment of
like a loss of innocence, maybe, in a sense. Not a traumatic one, but just a growing up moment, like you said, coming of age.
Yes. And this sentence is so interesting too, because we think of men looking at girls or
Mm-hmm.
teenagers or young women, and there's that sense of lechery, of leering,
Mm-hmm.
right? But they're looking at her as if she's already steeped in the experiences I had only imagined. So we know that it's not unwelcome. It's this kind of
Yeah.
in between space where her curiosity is blooming along
Mm-hmm.
with her body, right?
Yeah. Well, and you get the feeling that a lot of this is in her own mind. Like, I didn't feel like this was an unsafe environment for her.
Right.
Right. Like this wasn't like a party her mom shouldn't have taken her to. So you get this like she's on the cusp of this. She's the one who's interpreting their gazes in this way
Mm-hmm.
because she wants to grow up. She's separating herself from her mother. She's, as they go along and she kind of realizes what's happened with her dad, like she is the one doing that transition. So you don't get that, like you said, the lecherous gaze. That's not really the
Right.
feeling that you get from this.
Right. Very true. And yes, no, absolutely. I did not feel like she was unsafe or like all of the men there were
Mm-hmm.
creeps, but we're in the first paragraph, third sentence,
Mm-hmm.
final sentence of the first paragraph. And so when you get the first part of that sentence, that people are looking at her not like you do a child, and
Mm-hmm.
then come up to her and treat her with a kind of knowingness. Right before that comma, there's the potential for it to be all
Mm-hmm.
of those things. And then we get the rest of that sentence with the experiences I had only imagined.
Mm-hmm.
And it all turns around
Mm-hmm.
and does what you were just describing, with it being her perspective and her
Mm-hmm.
curiosity and her desire and
Yeah.
her,
Yeah.
yeah, it's
That
fascinating.
exploration. Yeah.
Would you like to be part of a small, dedicated group of novelists? Would you like a consistent feedback loop while you're drafting your novel? Would you like weekly calls with an experienced developmental editor and writing coach? Want to be inspired by a close-knit community of fellow writers? My summer session of group coaching for novelists is now open for registration. Go to www.wordessential.com/fiction coaching. Get all the details about the session, listen to past group coaching writers describe their experience with me, and sign up for your free discovery call today. That's wordessential.com/fiction coaching.
For sure. I really loved her relationship with her mother in those first few paragraphs too. Just the way that her mom brought her here, but she refused to be with her mom, and that because her mom would render the uncomfortable comfortable and the potentially harmful harmless. And so she's kind of flirting with this, stranger, I'm an adult, I can make my own way. Attitude and mentality in those first few paragraphs. So I think, again, that's where you get that lightness, that innocence that's kind of
Mm-hmm.
changing.
Right. Right. And so much, we understand so much about the mother-daughter relationship from
Mm-hmm.
that little piece of the story. Her mother
Mm-hmm.
is the safety net,
Yeah.
right? But she's going over here across the room because she's
Yeah.
dabbling and exploring. And so, again, we see that the party is not something dangerous and the mother is
Mm-hmm.
not being, neglectful or anything
Yeah.
like that. But
Exactly. And the sentence here is, I remember seeing her in a group way off in another room, and I remember wanting to be with her because, as when I was a child, she'd served to protect me from persons who were overwhelming. And I remember being glad about the distance between us. So she wanted to have that overwhelm, that feeling of being a part of something new.
mm-hmm, yes. What else did you say in your opening sentence? Because I know there's more than this to unpack, but I'm like, ooh.
Well, and then her dad comes in and it's like she's a child again. It's the mother-daughter
Right.
relationship versus the father-daughter relationship. And it says, we held hands and wandered around, popping canapes into our mouth and drinking whatever was presented to us in so many tinkling glasses. It's just like her mom
Mm-hmm.
brings her and she's immediately, I want to be separated from my mother. Her dad comes and she's the little child holding his hand and going around and tasting all the snacks and, you know, and wandering around with him. So it's a presented, a different relationship. And he's kind of like, he represents her childhood, I think,
Mm-hmm.
because then when the affair is revealed, it creates that distance that she already had from her mother. So you
Mm-hmm.
get to see she's trying to grow up, but here is her childhood and then the turn after the climax of the
Right.
story.
Right. Well, and that turn is so interesting. She's straddling girlhood and womanhood.
Mm-hmm.
And when she's relating to her mother, she's pushing her envelope and striving for womanhood,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then
Yes.
when she's relating to her father, she's content to be the child, to go where he wants to take her, to hold his hand, to have
Mm-hmm.
the treats and everything. And that is part of her fun. And maybe the dad isn't safe in the way the mom is, you
Mm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
like besides this straddling the line between girlhood and womanhood, there's that sense of mother is home and safety and,
Mm-hmm.
food and nurturing. And dad goes off. He leaves the home. He's in the
Mm-hmm.
workplace. He's got this whole other world attached to him that she's not a part of the way she's a part
Right.
of her mother's life.
Mm-hmm.
So she attaches herself to him. And then there's that turn in her
Mm-hmm.
circumstances,
Yep.
which is where she really crosses that threshold and it's not pleasant.
Mm-mm.
Yeah. And when she does realize what's happening with her father and this other woman, she feels bad for her mother. And she feels bad
Mm-hmm.
that she doesn't think about her mother immediately. She says, with my discovery of my father and the woman, I hadn't thought about her.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's not until she sees her mother again that she realizes her first thought wasn't of her mother.
Mm-hmm.
No, and there's that allegiance between mother and daughter. At the same time, there's the pulling away from the mother to become a
Mm-hmm.
woman. And there's just so much interesting about parent child relationships and child adult
Mm-hmm.
transition. And she captures it in 2.5 pages.
Yeah. Well, and her father walks away from her, right? He doesn't take her with him in that moment. So she's been walking around with him, holding his hand. This revelation happens, and he gets up and walks away. And she's
Mm-hmm.
left there to sit in it without him, right? It's not like he tries to explain it. It's not like he tries to take her away from the situation. For all he knew, she sat there and had a conversation with this woman, right? He leaves. So, again, in that sense, like there's childhood walking away. Boom. And she's sitting there with this secret sitting next to her. And it even says, like, she sits in silence, just as she would with a friend, right? Who just
Yes.
told a secret. Um, Yeah, I can't. For a few minutes, I sat with her, not saying anything, as I would with a friend who had confided in me. And so, yeah, and then she feels guilt because she didn't immediately feel outrage or, defend her mother or step in, and think of her mother, even, which I
Mm-hmm.
found really interesting. I wasn't, again, it's almost like that. She's left the nest. Her mother's not as important. I don't know if important's the right word, but prominent, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think besides the parent child relationship
Mm-hmm.
being spotlighted here, I think there's a really interesting comment about women's relationships
Mm-hmm.
because The mother is safety to the child. The girl on the verge of womanhood wants to leave the mother. When her father's lover turns up, I sat with her as I would with a friend who had confided in me. So now the girl is comforting the lover. And then when she leaves her, she says, I did not go trailing after my father. I wanted to find my mother instead and put my arm around her as a way of asking forgiveness. I felt that I could not look my mother in the eyes for a long time to come, and it wasn't because I knew she was betrayed and couldn't tell her. With my discovery of my father and the woman, I hadn't thought about her. So the daughter betrays the mother by not thinking about the mother. So then we've got the daughter narrator, the mother, and the lover in this triangle of women's relationships, and that idea of loyalty and betrayal and confidence and friendship, all around this secret comes to bear.
Which is interesting because if she hadn't put that sentence in there, I wouldn't have even thought that way. If that makes sense. Like, I wouldn't have thought of the girl as having betrayed her mother at all. It wouldn't have occurred to me. So I don't know that I would have even thought in that direction had she not put that sentence in there. And then I don't know about other women, but I am an overthinker. So she's, it's like that playing things over in your head. It makes it worse every time. And then you wait too long to tell them, or did I wait too long to tell them, or what should I do about this in order to fix it? And just that constant play. I related to that, right? Where all of a sudden it became her fault, even though it has nothing to do with her. Right? It's not her fault at all. It's her dad's fault. And the woman in the rose-colored dress's fault, I suppose, if you're going to assign blame. But there you go.
Yeah. Yes. I overthink too. I'm with you. Totally with you. I'm like, starting to overthink now.
I'm overthinking it this moment.
It's terrible. Save me. Yes. So there's another scene after that moment where she leaves the woman on the couch. The guests move toward a grand piano where a singer is singing a song, a funny song about a couple of lovers whose ineptness increased with their desire. So at the end of each stanza, something goes wrong for the lovers and they have ridiculous disasters. And now we have this circumstance around the parents and the love affair, and a finer point is being put upon it by the circumstance of the party and the song and the ridiculousness. And so she's got to see, that affair in a new context, almost from the private to the public, from the intimate to the spectacle. Even though the secret is still a secret, it's now happening in this larger context. And she says her mother was in the crowd, her face between other faces. And I felt an uprush of love and concern for her. She had support in numbers, but no matter how many joined together at that piano and everywhere else to be little lovers, I knew that all attempts would end in failure. What do you make of this final scene and that end note?
I don't know what to think about the very end. I knew that all attempts would end in failure. I read it about 4 or 5 times, trying to kind of figure out what she was trying to say there. And I'm not entirely sure that I've succeeded. But the final scene, I kept noticing it was like she's discovered this thing that happens, right? That there's an affair in her family even. And then there's this song about lovers, and everyone is laughing with their eyes closed or looking sideways, or, it says they were averting their eyes from everyone else's eyes. So it's this private thing that they're laughing about in public, but that no one really would want to talk about, is kind of the idea that I think she's trying to convey. Like I said, it's so short. Sometimes there's so much meaning packed into everything that it's hard to get an exact interpretation. But it just felt like she was saying that the whole thing is private made public that should be private, and that even in their mockery of it, it's not something that's really funny.
Mm. Hmm. Yeah. Do you think she means to say that everyone in the room is cheating? Is that
I
why they
don't
can't look at each other?
no,
Everyone
I think
except her mother is
it's
having an
that
affair.
discomfort with, I think it's just private made public sometimes can be uncomfortable for people, and depending on levels of secretness, it doesn't have to be an affair, but even just other aspects of relationships that are uncomfortable for people to have private made public. That if the song is about ineptitude and about failure and about all these things, they could just be uncomfortable with things that are touching, you know,
Hmm.
hurt points, and so she's seeing this in a different light now. It's not all funny. It's not all fun and games. It's not this curiosity that she had at the beginning, this knowingness and that of things that she'd only imagined. Now, all of a sudden, not all of it's imagined anymore. And
Hmm.
what's funny isn't necessarily actually funny.
Right. Right. Yeah. I just thought she was describing their laughter and the way they were
Mm-hmm.
laughing when I read it. And I thought it was some of the description was a little bit odd, like their eyes were closed up tight
Mm-hmm.
with their laughter or swam sideways. So I just thought they were laughing so hard their faces were screwed up, but maybe it's more than that. It's that
Yeah.
comfort with the secret, or maybe that everybody has their own secret, whether it's an affair or
Mm-hmm.
something else, or an embarrassing moment in the bedroom, or
It just felt like everybody was laughing because they were supposed to laugh. It felt to
yeah.
me like a forced laughter moment.
Hmm.
I mean, the people that are looking sideways are like, is everybody laughing? Okay, we're laughing. Ha 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 ha. Like,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. And she sees her mom, the last paragraph. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I guess we might as well read
Just
it
read it.
quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. My mother was in the crowd. I saw her across the piano, her face closed in between two other faces. She was sliding her eyes and clicking her tongue and laughing, like all the others around her, and I felt an uprush of love and concern for her. She had support in numbers, but no matter how many joined together at the piano and everywhere else to belittle lovers, I knew that all attempts would end in failure. I think through the narrator's lens, with this new knowledge of her father's affair, she looks at her mother in this crowd of people belittling lovers by laughing at this song about
Mm-hmm.
lovers' foibles. And so that's that support in numbers, but no matter how much we laugh at the lovers and
Mm-hmm.
find fault with them and mock them, all attempts to belittle them end in failure, because no matter how much you laugh, the truth is it hurts. So she knows that her mother is going to be hurt once the
Hurt.
secret
Mm-hmm.
comes out. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That makes more sense. A lot
Mm-hmm.
of these sentences in here, and I know I'm going off topic, but a lot of these sentences in here are very complex. They're long and compound.
Mm-hmm.
And so you do have to read very carefully to try and parse some of what the meaning is.
Well, okay,
All
is there a
attempts to
sentence?
belittle the lovers. No, like the last one that you just read, like you saying that was like, oh, that makes more sense. That it was all the attempts to belittle the lovers would end in
Mm,
failure.
right, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they are complex sentences,
Mhm.
so a little warm up for Chekhov.
Well, and beyond that, it gives the story a different feel, right? Because all the sentences are kind of like long. And I wouldn't say they just felt sort of like languishing, like in a good way. Like it was just like you could
Mm-hmm.
kind of steep in it, right? There wasn't like a really fast pace. Everything just kind of
Right.
spooled out. Like you were experiencing, like the party was something that was just like little bits here and little bits there. And like it took time. Like it didn't
Right.
feel rushed. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's a large part due to the length of the sentences and the amount of complexity in terms of the language there.
Mm-hmm. Which is one of its strengths. You know, what you were just saying about it feeling like we're experiencing this party over time and we're
Mhm.
getting these pieces of it the way you do in a party. When you
Mhm.
spend 3 or 4 hours at a party, you don't go home and have a memory that walks you through 3 or 4 hours. You go home and it's
Right.
like, oh, there's this moment and there's that moment and this
Yeah.
conversation and that piece of cake or whatever.
Mhm.
And without any scene breaks in just 2.5 pages, the tone of this creates that experience,
Mhm.
which is
Yeah.
remarkable.
Mhm.
My newsletter, A Room Full of Books and Pencils, is growing every week with new reflections, writing tips, and transcripts of the podcast. It's also where I make announcements about things like upcoming writing workshops and coaching sessions. Check out A Room Full of Books and Pencils at booksandpencils.substack.com. Yeah.
Yeah. There's just not any rushing. And even like her experience of this event that could have been very, like, I don't know, jolting, there didn't feel like there was any sort of like moment. It just, sorry, sound effect. But it felt like it was just a flowing piece, and the emotions themselves were very, like, everything was pretty tight and mild and not over the top or dramatic, which as a 13-year-old girl, she could have been. Um, but she wasn't. So,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, the whole, like you said, the tone of it and just the pacing of it is really kind of lends itself to that.
Yes. Yeah, it does. I think we should talk about the scene in the middle when the woman walks in.
Yes.
And maybe we should just read it because it is so well
Yeah.
executed. Okay. So the narrator and her father go into a room separate from the party and sit down on a couch. The young woman came in timidly, as if she needed to ask a favor from persons who had never seen her before. She seemed unsteady on her feet, and I guessed it was because of the drink she must have had. She sat down at the other end of the couch, and on the other side of my father, and then I knew she had followed us. "This is Mary, my daughter," he said to her, but it was more like a warning and not an introduction, and he didn't tell me her name. "How are you?" he asked her. "You know how I am," she said. "Mary, will you go?" he asked me, only it was a command. "Where's your mother?" But he wasn't much of a figure to command. There was a roughness in his throat like a cough held back, and his eyes were afraid. If he lost the authority of the father for that moment, he gained another kind, and it was the authority of the man experienced beyond his family's ever knowing. What he knew about his own life that his family didn't know seemed to grant me my own untellable experiences to come. It was as if he gave me carte blanche to the world. I couldn't get up and leave then. I thought I might, but I couldn't. She didn't wait for me to go. She said to him in a low voice, her sidelong gaze on her hand smoothing the velvet of the couch. "I want to ask you if you ever came over to see me. I moved away so that when you came by, you'd see I wasn't waiting for you. But after I moved, I wish I'd stayed in the same place and gone on waiting. She was no longer the fearful young woman in awe of my father. She was a voluptuous woman, with heavy thighs under her rose-colored silky dress. And when my father realized that I saw her as he had seen her in the past, and must still see her in the present, then he got up and strode away from us both. For a few minutes I sat with her, not saying anything, as I would with a friend who had confided in me. She was stroking the couch, her hand moving in little circles toward the empty place where my father had been.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is the pivotal scene in this story where we have the awakening, the climax. The woman
Mm-hmm.
comes in, and their entire relationship is explained in this little bit of dialogue where she says she waited for him because she wanted, or she waited and then
She
she
moved
left
away, yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
she wanted him to come by and then she regretted that and wish she had waited. And you just know this was a long term affair, that he probably made her all kinds of promises. Her heart was broken. Like, you can gather so much information from that
Mm-hmm.
little bit of
Yeah.
dialogue.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's that is a beautiful illustration of subtext doing its work well. You
Mm-hmm.
know, you
Yeah.
want to create subtext? Read this story, study
Right.
it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And that bit in the middle about how he lost his authority. He lost the authority of the father, but he gained another kind, the authority of the man, experienced beyond his family's ever knowing.
Mm-hmm.
Right, which goes back to that idea of the girl wanting to leave the safety of the mother, but being happy to trail around with
Mm-hmm.
the father because it's the known world and the unknown world, the safe
Mm-hmm.
and the adventurous.
Mm-hmm.
She just didn't know what kind of adventurous.
No. Yeah. And it's like a worldly authority rather than a familial authority. So he's no longer so much the father as he is just this, like she says, just a man, right?
Mm-hmm.
And similar to how she described the men in the beginning, knowing more um things that she wanted to know more. It was interesting. Yeah. And then the change in the young woman and the way she sees her. So initially she just sees a young woman and then she, again, in the same, knowingness, right? She kind of
Mm-hmm.
turns into, a more sexualized being, which is a very interesting transformation in just a sentence. She turns and looks at her again, and this time she sees maybe what her father might have seen, and it changes her perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is really interesting too, because I keep holding this idea of we've got the child turning to an adult and the mother, father, daughter relationship, but then we've also got this relationship amongst the women
Mm-hmm.
in the story. And the girl sees the woman in the rose colored dress as somebody who needs a favor or wants to ask a question, right? Who's a little bit lost and tipsy and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then in that moment where it turns around, she sees the woman as a sex object, which puts
Mm-hmm.
her in that role of competition, if not with her, then with her mother,
Yes.
right? And now she sees what a man sees looking at her. And,
Mm-hmm.
frighteningly what her father sees.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. But that's that coming of age moment. That's that loss of innocence. That's that knowledge that she was kind of sort of seeking at the beginning that now she has discovered. And like you said, in a way that she wouldn't necessarily want to discover it.
Right.
Um, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This is a masterful short story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you read something like this, it's very easy to read it. It's 2.5 pages. You might be done in 15 minutes or something, maybe 5 or 10, depending. And you're like, oh, okay, yeah. So girl party affair, got it. But when you start to really look at it and examine what's happening on the page and how so much can be happening in such a short word count, it's remarkable.
It is. And it reads almost like a memoir. I know it's fiction, but it looks and reads like a memoir. Yes. My mother took me along to that party because my 13th birthday fell only one day after. And I had to recenter I went and read the author's biography because I was like, oh, well, what kind of, cultural arena are we in? And then I'm like, it doesn't have to be hers because this is fiction, right? But I wanted to know, is 13 a coming of age? Is this a cultural thing where she's now a woman? Is this, something where her mom was just like, oh, you're old enough now? Why don't we just go to this party? Or was it something more culturally significant to her? And then I was like, I can't know that from this story because it's not in here and you can't infer it from the author, but it read so much like a memoir that I was like, oh, I wonder.
Right.
I was like, nope.
Yeah. Yeah, it does read that way, which is because the first person narrator is so well done. And she doesn't ever call attention to any sort of difference to the gap between the perspective of the narrator and the perspective of the child, but it is present.
Yeah. Yeah, you definitely don't get the idea that it's a 13-year-old girl telling this story. It's a memory. The narrator is to me, it was very distant because the emotional distance was so large.
Right.
So.
Yes. And in my mind, I don't know if it's true, but just reading this, I had the sense, I just felt like this party was happening in the 1970s. There's a little bit of discussion of dresses and her hair was cut short and such. And maybe it was the 80s. I don't know, but it just felt to me like it was the 70s. That was where I was picturing it in my mind's eye as I was reading it. Right.
Yeah, it definitely didn't feel modern.
No.
Well, and them all gathering around the piano and having an entertainer sing songs. And there was just a nostalgic feel to it. Much more like in my past rather than in any sort of current modern day feel to it.
Right. Yeah. Any other thoughts we want to share on the woman in the rose-colored dress? All right, great. Well, next time we have a writer's book club, we will be talking about The Lady with the Little Dog by Anton Chekhov, also to be found at narrativemagazine.com.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.
Yeah, I do love me some Russian authors, though.
Yeah.